So for the last talk, we have Eileen here. Well, right now she works as a staff engineer at GitHub. Yeah, yeah, some whoop, whoop, whoop. And which is, well, at least one small step up from something that she did before. She worked on a conveyor belt. Well, not an actual conveyor belt. She was working at a photo studio, making pictures by the thousands of people, and she didn't really enjoy that. And I think that the work that she does right now is much more specialized, and, well, I think it will give anyone more joy than doing things by the thousands. I'd like to have a hand of applause for Eileen. Woo!
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me all in the back? Yeah. Up there? Good. OK. Oh, there's like this countdown timer that's really stressful, because it started before I got up here. I first just want to say thank you to the organizers for throwing a great conference and inviting me to be your final keynote. Hopefully you're not disappointed and you enjoy the rest of this. The only thing you will be disappointed by is I don't have ship puns, because I don't do puns. If you want puns, go talk to Aaron. He does it all day long. All right, let's get started. So as they said already, I'm Eileen. You can find me anywhere online at the handle Eileen Codes. Twitter, GitHub, blog, email, unless I don't want you to find me, and then it's not Eileen Codes. I'm a staff engineer at GitHub on our Ruby architecture team. We are responsible for improving the Rails framework and the Ruby language so that it benefits GitHub. We add features, we reduce technical debt in the application, and we try to make sure that the code that our engineers are writing is going to work with current and newer versions of Rails and Ruby. I'm also on the Rails core team. For anyone who's new to the Ruby ecosystem, the Rails core team decides the future of the framework. We are a group of, I think, 12. I don't know. I lost count. Anyway, there's some number of us that, we review your pull requests, merge them, decide what we actually want the next version to look like, and then do the actual release. So each year, I reflect back on what work I've been doing and what I've learned, and what I'd like to share with all of you at conferences that I speak at each year. And when I started writing the abstract for this talk, I originally thought that I wanted to talk about the intimate details of upgrading Rails at GitHub. I had spent more than a year and a half working on upgrading GitHub from Rails 3.2 to 5.2, and I certainly could talk about it for hours, maybe even days or weeks, at least until you were all bored. But as I started to explore the themes around upgrading, I realized that there was a deeper story that I wanted to explore. I started thinking about the following questions, like, how did we even end up so far behind Rails master in the first place? What past decisions did we make in our code base that made upgrading harder? What drove us to upgrade when we were so far behind? And what does our future look like now that we've actually finished it? The story I want to tell you is the story of the past, present, and future of Rails at GitHub. We've been using Rails at GitHub since day one, and at times, Rails and GitHub, we've had our differences. Many years ago, we forked Rails and we practically wrote our own version. We fought against the framework, we deviated from the framework, and we even wondered if Rails was right for us at all. But at the end of the day, GitHub is successful because of Rails, and Rails is successful because of GitHub. Our upgrade didn't just make for a good blog post for Hacker News to criticize. The Rails upgrade made it possible for us to use and invest in Rails so that we can continue using it for the long haul. We can change and influence the framework for our needs while also benefiting the broader Rails community. This story is part historical. We'll look back at the beginning to how GitHub ended up maintaining a custom fork of Rails 2. It's also part technical, exploring what compelled us to upgrade our process and why it was so difficult. We'll look at the costs of not upgrading and how it causes technical debt to accumulate until your application and framework start to work against each other. And lastly, this story is part forward-looking. We'll dive into our effort at GitHub to clean up technical debt, our commitment to open source, and our responsibility to support Rails for the long haul. But first, let's go back in time to the beginning. In 2004, DHH announced a new Ruby framework called Ruby on Rails. Immediately, Rails caught the attention of the Ruby community. At RubyConf that year, DHH talked about Rails' history, how it came to be, and of course, why it's better than existing Ruby frameworks. He went on to talk about his philosophy in building the framework, most notably that many frameworks fail because they're built without an application in mind. He said that frameworks are retrospectives. They should be extracted, not built. Rails was attractive and successful because it was extracted from a real application, Basecamp. In the early years, Rails complexity grew slowly, and Rails 1.0 was released in December of 2005. 2 years later, Rails 1.2 was released. That same year, Tom Preston Warner was at a Ruby meetup in San Francisco when he showed his friend Chris Rainsrath a tool called Git. Git was a Ruby tool that allowed you to view Git repositories in an object-oriented way. It would become the basis for Git repositories on GitHub. After seeing Git, Chris was immediately hooked, and a few days later, the GitHub Rails application was born. It was created using Rails 1.2.3, and after a short beta, GitHub was launched to the public in April of 2008. The next day, Rails moved their own SVN server to GitHub. In 2009, Rails 2.3 was released. In the early days, when Rails would release a new version, GitHub would quickly upgrade to get new features and bug fixes, and they were so excited. But sometime between 2008 and 2009, GitHub had forked Rails. I couldn't find an exact date because we vendor our gems and there wasn't any commits that made it clear exactly when we forked, but it was sometime between these 2 years. I had personally always thought that GitHub had forked Rails because Rails 3.0 was known to be very slow enough that many applications actually couldn't upgrade either, but it turns out that we forked Rails long before that was ever a problem. Now remember, this is the Wild West of Rails startups. No one really knew what the future of Rails or GitHub was going to be. We weren't yet talking about the importance of upgrades or staying current with Rails master. And honestly, Rails just wasn't as stable as it is today. I don't want to go so far as to say that Rails didn't care about performance or stability at this time, but certainly a lot of developers felt that way. It definitely wasn't a concern the way it is today. We work really hard now to make sure that we're not breaking apps. Maybe it was because we were all kind of inexperienced back then. Or maybe it was because Rails was good enough for its most important user, Basecamp. Or maybe it was because we, GitHub, didn't contribute enough upstream. I don't really know, but I'm also not criticizing the past. It's important to understand what happened then so that we can avoid these things in the future. The problem was that GitHub didn't just fork Rails and add a bug fix here, performance improvement there. It wasn't just a fork with backports from upstream. GitHub's fork was Rails with custom code just for GitHub. It was Rails morphed into a different framework that was built for GitHub the way Rails was built for Basecamp. As GitHub doubled down on their fork and added more and more functionality, Rails continued to progress at a fast pace as well. At the time, no one could predict or understand the cost that forking Rails would have on the GitHub application or engineering team. In 2010, Rails 3.0 was released, but many applications couldn't upgrade due to performance concerns. These performance issues in 3.0 were a big deal. Users saw an unacceptable increase in response times, some applications seeing requests taking as much as twice as long. Active record in Rails 3 was found to be 5 times slower than Rails 2. Despite knowing about these performance concerns, an engineer at GitHub started working on upgrading GitHub from Rails 2 to 3, and also working on upgrading Ruby to 1.9. See, GitHub didn't just fork Rails, we also forked Ruby. So that makes upgrades really pretty difficult. We don't have that problem anymore. It's gone. The Rails 3 upgrade wasn't pointing at Rails 3 upstream either. It was still a fork with GitHub's custom patches added on top. From experience, I can tell you that maintaining a fork while you're trying to upgrade and then having to add all of that stuff from your last fork on top of your new fork is enough to make someone want to quit programming. And I don't recommend it. In 2012, Rails 3.2 was released, and most of the performance concerns had been fixed in Rails had been fixed by Aaron Patterson and other contributors. In the same year the performance issues were fixed, GitHub's progress on the Rails upgrade stalled. It had been 2 years since they started the 3.0 upgrade, and the engineering team began questioning whether the effort was worth it at all. They asked each other, why upgrade when this version isn't causing us any pain? Why upgrade when Rails 3.0 isn't so great? All those performance concerns are concerns as well. Why upgrade when this fork has more features than Rails upstream? Looking at these questions, the engineering team decided the upgrade wasn't worth their effort and focused their attention on other projects. The truth is that at this time, GitHub wasn't yet feeling how painful being on a fork was. And it's difficult to convince a team to upgrade when they're still feeling productive. You make your tests faster when they feel too slow and CI is blocking you from deploying. You refactor the complexity of that class when you need to add new functionality. But when do you upgrade? What's the incentive if the new version isn't better enough and your fork is just fine? If you're not feeling the pain of being on a fork or an old version, you're just not going to be compelled to upgrade. Eventually, though, all of these why should we upgrade questions would become suffocating for GitHub's engineering team. It became harder and harder to find where the framework ended and the application began as GitHub engineers began fighting against the fork and their application. Security backports were a nightmare. Each time Rails announced a vulnerability, GitHub was forced to patch it manually. Hiring was becoming increasingly difficult. Nobody wanted to work on a Rails 2.3 application that doesn't even resemble Rails 2. It's harder to get up to speed, and you can't Google search how to do anything. Dependencies were brittle and unsupported as gem authors focused on new versions of Rails and abandoned the old ones. Development was slow and painful. Working with an application that is tied so heavily to a custom fork can make adding features or refactoring code increasingly difficult. We realized that we needed to upgrade and get off a fork, or that fork was going to suffocate the application. In 2014, a team of 4 full-time engineers and a few volunteers banded together, wrote an upgrade plan, and got to work. It took that team 6 months of full-time coordinated effort to deploy Rails 3.0 to production, and a few months later, Rails 3.2 was deployed as well. It's important to remember, though, that here 3.0 and 3.2 are still a fork with GitHub custom patches added on top. By this time, the Rails 3 series was only receiving severe security patches. So even though the upgrade was a success, the code base was still very, very far behind. The effort putting into upgrading from 2.3 to 3.2 was massive, and motivation dwindled after that. It would be another 2 years before the Rails 4.0 upgrade was even started. That same year, Rails 5 came out. I'm sure to some it felt like GitHub just was never going to catch up if Rails was constantly improving and releasing new versions. In 2017, I joined GitHub. At this point, the Rails 4.0 upgrade was not in a good place. There was no dedicated team working on it, and the upgrade had fallen by the wayside. It was something that people worked on when they had an extra hour or two, not something where anyone was dedicating any efforts to. So on my first day, I asked Hubot, our little bot that runs tests for us, I said, hey, Hubot, why don't you tell me how bad Rails 4.0 is right now? And so I asked Hubot, hey, run the tests. And there were over 4,000 errors. Luckily, Hubot can't count, and it's more like 2,500. Easy, right? Luckily for me, after the Rails 3.0 upgrade, GitHub engineers had added some tooling that made Rails upgrades easier, so that they should theoretically take less time. We had a system that allowed us to boot the application in multiple Rails versions. This means that we don't need to maintain long-running upgrade branches, and can merge into master when we're ready. By adding the ability to dual boot the application, we could focus only on test failures instead of merge conflicts. Unfortunately, this method requires us to hack Bundler because Bundler doesn't support multiple gem files and dual booting, but I'd rather monkey patch Bundler than fork Rails. With this method, we're able to boot the server console and run tests in multiple Rails versions, which makes it easy to compare and contrast behavior between the version that's in production and the version that we're upgrading to. This process allows us to incrementally upgrade Rails over time, and also helps us prevent regressions once we have an upgraded version. So when Rails 4.0 was green, we made sure that everyone at GitHub had to write code that passed in 3.2 and 4.0. And then when 4.1 was green, we'd swap out the build and make sure that everyone wrote code that passed in 3.2 and 4.1. And we did this for every single version until we had 5.2 and Rails Master. In the application code, we used helper methods to easily condition for the different Rails versions. We always put the production version in the if clause, not the elf clause, the if clause, and all future code in the else. That way, when we upgrade to 4.2, we don't accidentally fall into the 3.2 branch of the code. In March of 2018, a year and 3 months after I started working at GitHub, we deployed Rails 4.2 to production with 0 downtime and no customer impact. After deploying 4.2 to production, we immediately started the Rails 5 upgrade, but this time with a larger team. For the 5 series, I led a team of 4 full-time engineers and utilized GitHub's projects and issues to make the work easier to divvy up. Because we had a dedicated team and a streamlined process, the upgrade from 4.2 to 5.2 took only 5 months, and in August of 2018, we deployed Rails 5.2 to production, also with 0 downtime and no customer impact. We learned a lot from our 4.2 deploy, so we were way less nervous deploying 5.2. I think 4.2 probably took us 3 or 4 months to actually deploy it, whereas 5.2 was maybe 1 month. Sometimes you might hear me complain about our test suite, but it actually isn't that bad for upgrades. This was a huge milestone. It was the first time in 10 years that GitHub wasn't on a fork of Rails. It was the first time in 10 years that GitHub was on the most recent version of Rails. That's 10 years of cumulative technical debt and 10 years of fighting our fork in our application. And we finally had started to pay that debt off. By upgrading, we don't eliminate technical debt, but it creates breathing room in your application that we just didn't have in a decade. I hope that learning about our upgrade hasn't scared you into not doing your own. The point of this talk is not to tell horror stories. It's to show you that there's a cost to not upgrading, and that cost is cumulative. After hearing about the Rails upgrade at GitHub, I've had engineers come to me and ask me, how can I convince my leadership team to prioritize an upgrade? They don't have the resources, or it's not in their roadmap, it's not a priority, or the company thinks it'll be too expensive. It's true that upgrading is expensive and time-consuming. I'm not going to lie to you and tell you otherwise. But it's a lot easier to say that this upgrade will need X number of engineers at Y number of dollars for Z number of hours. You can actually calculate and measure that cost and decide whether or not it's too expensive or not. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how expensive upgrading your application will be, because the cost of not upgrading is immeasurable. Not upgrading your application will eventually cost more than any upgrade because of the debt that accumulates. When you don't upgrade Rails, you have to become a security expert. The Rails core team only supports patching security vulnerabilities in the major current version and the major versions of the previous version, which means that as soon as we release Rails 6, 4.2 is no longer supported. And I know a lot of you in this room are still using 4.2. If you're using Rails 4.2 or lower, your team is going to end up being responsible for understanding and patching those vulnerabilities yourself. It's very hard to get this right because on the Rails security team, we don't tell you how to exploit the vulnerability, or at least we try not to. Not upgrading requires you to become a security expert, and for you and your team to manually patch vulnerabilities if you're on an old version. When you upgrade Rails, you lose out on great talent. Bootcamp grads, college grads, career changers, all kinds of new engineers that you're hiring aren't learning Rails 2.3, and they're definitely not learning your weird custom fork. Those engineers not only don't want to work on an old version, they just don't even have the skill or knowledge of how it even worked. Engineers will turn on the opportunity to work for you if you're on an old version because it doesn't let them contribute to open source, it's no longer Googleable, and it's 10 years old. When you don't upgrade, some of the gems that you rely on will get deprecated, and so you'll either have to live with bugs or fork yet another dependency. New gems may not support old versions of Rails, so you won't be able to use those if you're on an old unsupported version. This makes development a lot harder. Every choice in dependency becomes more and more difficult because you're so far behind. Maintaining old gems on top of your old framework is going to get tedious really quickly. When you don't upgrade Rails, you end up building more and more infrastructure on top of your fragile application. I've seen this firsthand at GitHub. We have tons of infrastructure code in our app, multiple databases, CI tooling, our own job queue, and honestly, probably things I haven't found yet. Ideally, your application would consist only of code that makes your product work, or makes your product's value. GitHub's value is not that we have multiple databases in Rails. Our value is in our product, our issues, our pull requests, our repos, our community. Multiple databases allows us to keep our application up and running, but it's not why all of you here are using it. At least I hope not. This infrastructure code makes development more painful because of how tightly it couples your application to Rails internals. Minor changes can turn into massive refactorings or abandoned projects altogether. But the biggest cost of not upgrading Rails is that someday someone is going to decide that using Rails was a mistake, and it's time to carve your application up into microservices. Now, this isn't a language war talk. I'm not interested in having that conversation. I'm not criticizing Go or how companies build their infrastructure. But if you already have a monolith, just respect the monolith. Also, we're at a Ruby conference, so I'm going to assume that you all at least like writing Ruby. It might seem like an exaggeration, but if we don't upgrade Rails, we don't get to keep writing Ruby. The Ruby ecosystem won't improve, our applications will degrade, and we'll be faced with an expensive rewrite. And as Matt said yesterday, if Ruby dies, his family dies, so by the transitive property, if you don't upgrade Rails, Matt's family will die. That's heavy. That's heavy. The key to upgrading Rails is to incrementally pay off technical debt so that you've incurred and figure out a plan to keep that debt paid down. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that upgrading Rails will be easy. I will leave that to the person on Hacker News who wondered why I couldn't do it in a weekend. I must be so incompetent. The upgrade did take a long time, but it wasn't the only thing that we worked on. I took time to delete unused features. I rewrote our custom test framework. I improved our database handling for development and test environments. It's unfair for anyone to look at our upgrade timeline and decide that using Rails is too expensive. We made choices at GitHub that made upgrading our application a lot harder and made it take many more years. You have made choices in your application that will make your upgrade harder too. But that doesn't mean that Rails is a bad choice. Technical debt is real, and you can write it in any language. You and your team need to make decisions about what technical debt you're willing to accept. At GitHub, we've decided that being behind Rails Master is no longer technical debt that we're willing to put up with. You can slowly work on technical debt and upgrade Rails to get your application into a better place. There are a few things that you should consider when upgrading and mistakes that you can avoid so that you avoid doing a 2 to 7 year upgrade like we did at GitHub. The first most important step is to build out a team. Upgrades are really difficult, and it helps to have a team that can support each other, bounce ideas off of, and make sure that momentum keeps up. If you have a one-person upgrade team and that person leaves the company, your upgrade's going to be stalled or likely stopped altogether. Make sure to create redundancy when doing such a difficult task. If you have a really small team and you just can't stop feature development to upgrade Rails, consider hiring a contracting firm to help you get out of the weeds. It will be expensive, but it's still cheaper than never upgrading. This can also help you institute best practices so that you don't end up so far behind in the future. Another thing that makes upgrades easier is taking time to plan your upgrade. Your team should ask themselves, do we want to upgrade incrementally from 3.2 to 4.0 to 4.1, or do we want to go straight from 3.2 to 5.2? There are a lot of reasons why you might want to do one or the other, so making those considerations with your team is really important. You can also make upgrades easier by fixing deprecation warnings early. Instead of ignoring them to take care of for the next version, consider fixing them as soon as you see them. Some deprecations are related to major changes, so they can block your application from booting until they're fixed. One example is the deprecation of alias method chain. That is going to block your application from booting until you fix all of them. And so then that way you can actually work in parallel with your team to upgrade faster. So it's really important to fix these early. And once you've upgraded to the most recent version, make a plan for the future. How often will your team upgrade Rails later on, or in the future? Are you willing to test new releases of Rails in the beta or release candidate phase? This helps make upgrades smoother for you and everyone else, because then you can tell the Rails team what was hard. Plus, you're changing your application as Rails changes, and it's a lot easier to debug those than 6 years later. If you can't run Rails master in production, can you invest in a dual booting CI so that you can test 5.2 and 6 simultaneously? If you invested in upgrading, it makes sense for you to invest in future tooling so that you can stay out of upgrade debt in the future. Now that we've looked at considerations you should make when upgrading, we're going to look at things that you will regret, and you should not do them. There are a lot of choices that you can make in your application that will make upgrades or maintaining your application more difficult. Something you're likely to regret in the future is forking Rails. The choice to fork Rails was the single most expensive choice that we made in regards to our application at GitHub. This had a compounding effect on the state of the code base that made our upgrade take way longer than it should have. If you absolutely must fork Rails, you should try to track the upstream version as closely as possible and only backport bug fixes or features that you need. If you add features that you never intend to upstream into your fork, then your fork is going to deviate from Rails and it's going to make upgrading more difficult in the future. Another thing that you may regret down the road is falling behind Rails upgrades until the point the Rails team no longer supports your version. If you need to stay on an old unsupported version of Rails, you should use something like Rails long-term support, because they'll maintain the fork for you, so that way at least you're not doing weird stuff to it. If you fall behind on Rails upgrades, you'll end up writing your own patches, and you may do it wrong, and then you're going to leave an insecure endpoint, and that's not good for anybody. In general, the best way to apply a security patch is by using Rails upstream. It's the safest, most secure way to know that your application is solid. If you're also using old unsupported gems, then your upgrade will be more difficult because you'll be required to replace those dependencies before you can finish your upgrade. It's very hard to replace dependencies while you're also trying to upgrade Rails. Ensure that you upgrade dependencies often to keep in line with the Rails requirements. That way, it helps prevent you from relying on a gem that gets abandoned. All of these things that we looked at and more can compound the cost of your upgrade. It's easy to see how these decisions accumulate debt in our applications. I'm hoping that by now you're feeling a bit more confident that you too can upgrade Rails. I know it's going to be hard. You might cry. You'll definitely get angry. You may curse past engineers that worked at your company. I know I did. I apologize to all of you who I cursed. But I want you to know that you can do it. I have faith in you. You might be thinking, okay, well, Eileen, maybe it wasn't easy, but you're on the Rails core team and you work at GitHub and I'm not capable of doing an upgrade. It's too hard, or I don't have the talent and I just don't know how to do it. So I'm going to tell you something that shocks a lot of people, not because I want to pat myself on my back, but because I want you to know that you can do this. Before the Rails 3.2 to 5.2 upgrade, I had never done a major multi-version Rails upgrade before in my career, ever. If I can do it, you can do it. I'm not smarter than you. I'm not better than you. I might be more stubborn than you, but you can learn that. Upgrading isn't going to be easy if you've taken on these cumulative costs that we looked at. While you're working on your upgrade, it's important to remember a few things. You don't have to solve all of your technical debt problems tomorrow. You can pay down debt incrementally. Start with a class that uses a private Rails API. Remove or document your monkey patches. Identify and upgrade Rails dependencies that are out of date. Rails upgrades are not a sprint. They are a marathon. They actually kind of never end. If you and your team pay debt down incrementally that you've incurred over time, you will eventually get to the point where your application is in a much healthier place. I also want you to remember that you're not alone. Many before you have done an upgrade, and many after you will do an upgrade. Find others doing upgrades at the same time, or folks that have done it in the past, and lean on them for support. And lastly, remember that the payoff is worth it. Upgrades take a long time and are difficult, but being afraid of upgrading isn't going to make it go away. When your application is finally upgraded, it's going to be in a much better place. In addition to better security, easier hiring, and more manageable dependencies, doing the hard work of upgrading will give you improved APIs. Major version upgrades of Rails allow the Rails team to think about what APIs can we improve in the future. An example of an improved API in Rails 6 is the handling for multiple databases. Before Rails 6, adding multiple databases to an application was awful and very hard. You had to write a ton of code yourself, but in Rails 6, we've added new APIs for establishing and handling connections, as well as an improved API around active record database configurations. Without upgrading, you don't have access to these improvements. Upgrading to new versions of Rails also improves security. In addition to security upgrades being easier if you're not behind, each version of Rails adds new security features to protect your application from your users and bad actors, or protect your users from bad actors. You don't want to protect your app from your users. Actually, maybe you do. Maybe you do. In Rails 5, we introduced perform CSRF tokens. Rails 5.2 introduced encrypted secrets, and Rails 6 is going to ship with improved security around potentially dangerous ARL methods. These features help keep your application safe and secure, but because they're actually features, you can't get them unless you upgrade to Rails. You can't get them on the LTS fork. And although Rails 3.0 is plagued by horrible performance issues, newer versions of Rails have focused on better performance. Shneem's talked about some stuff that he fixed in Active Record. I know that Rails 6 is shipping with a memory leak fix for view loading and development, and we also have faster active support notifications. Using Rails also gets you access to new features and libraries. Rails 6 is shipping with brand new libraries like Action Text, Action Mailbox, and our new auto-loading framework called Zeitwerk. By upgrading, you can rely on new features in Rails without building your own infrastructure tooling into your application. In an ideal world, your application would contain only code that pertains to your product. If your product isn't about sending mail, you shouldn't write code that sends mail into your application. Upgrading Rails helps you keep the line where Rails ends and your application begins crystal clear. And lastly, upgrading your application gives you a chance to contribute upstream. It's really difficult to fix bugs, add features, and influence the future of Rails from an old version. It's not a requirement to contribute if you're on a new version and don't feel like it, but it definitely opens doors that are otherwise closed. As DHH said in 2004 and many times since, frameworks are extracted. We build Rails from our existing needs, but if those needs are set back in Rails 2.3, it's really hard to make a case for an extraction that we require. All of these are good reasons to upgrade, but this is the one that kept me going. This is the reason that I spent a year and a half upgrading Rails at GitHub. It was so that we could influence the future of Rails. For GitHub, this is the biggest and most important reason to upgrade. By upstreaming features, fixing bugs, and supporting Rails' future, we support our future as well. When I look back at when I started the 3.2 to 5.2 upgrade, the thought of being on a modern version of Rails and actively contributing upstream felt like an unachievable fairy tale. We were so far behind, and I often wasn't sure that we could finish it, at least not without maintaining most of my sanity. That's still questionable, though. But now regularly contributing to Rails and supporting the future of Rails is GitHub's present and future state. Since upgrading Rails, GitHub engineers have sent over 75 pull requests to Rails 6 that improve performance, fix bugs, and add major features. Before we upgraded, we often were forced to monkey patch or work around bugs in overly complex ways. Yes, even though we had a fork, we still had lots of monkey patches. I don't understand it. Using Rails 5.2 has allowed us not just to contribute upstream, but to make choices that improve our application instead of hinder it. And all of you get to benefit from those changes as well. In addition to bug fixes and performance improvements, we've extracted major functionality from GitHub. I won't go into technical details, but we've extracted our handling for multiple databases in Rails 6. We've used our knowledge and expertise on database handling to create an easy-to-use, robust new API for defining, establishing, and switching between database connections in your application. We did this extraction not just because it benefits Rails, but because it allows us to reduce complexity in our application. Our goal is to never fall behind. We're investing in our application in Rails by doing continuous upgrades. Every week we bump Rails, and we run all of GitHub's tests against the new version and Rails 5.2 in production. Since we did the hard work of upgrading major versions, this new process means that we'll never fall behind, and upgrades are easy because we will do them as Rails changes instead of many years later. Because of this, we're confident that Rails 6 is stable, performant, and resilient. Continuous upgrades and our contributions to Rails are evidence that for the first time in history, in GitHub's history, we're not just using Rails or simply building a Rails application. For the first time in GitHub's history, we're pioneering the future of Rails. We're extracting code from GitHub, building new features into Rails that will help you scale your application, and giving back to open source to support Rails for the long haul. It makes good sense for us to do this. Not only do we give back to the community, but it helps keep our application focused on our product. We can reduce complexity and improve resilience, all while contributing to the future of Rails. At GitHub, we not only need to do this for our own application, but because we have a responsibility to support Rails. We owe part of our success to the Rails framework, and we have the influence, expertise, and application to help push Rails forward. Upgrading Rails was a huge investment. It wasn't cheap, but it was really worth it because it opens up a ton of possibilities for our future. We're building features faster, we're more confident our codebase is stable, and we're improving the scalability of Rails, all while giving back to the open source community. At a minimum, we went from being crushed by our application and Rails and the decisions that we'd made, to building up our application, to building up Rails, to building up our community. Upgrading gave us the freedom and flexibility that we didn't have before. It empowers our engineers to build more and build better. In 2007, GitHub was born, and 11 years later, we're finally tracking master. It took 7 years from the day the 3.0 upgrade was started to the day the 5.2 upgrade was complete. The future is bright, and I can't wait for you to see what the next 10 years allows us to extract from GitHub, build in Rails, and how the community thrives. At GitHub, we'll continue to invest in the future of Rails and our community because we have to, because we need to, and because we want to. We'll continue to invest in the future because GitHub and Rails are in it together for the long haul. And I hope you are too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eileen. That was wonderful. And it's funny you talk about a major upgrade because Arno and I just got upgraded to majors. A little treasure from us.
Thank you.